Don't go anywhere. This week, RPM has come under attack on the same subject from both Russell Brand and former Prime Minister John Major. One called him a filthy, dirty, posh wanker. I won't tell you what Russell Brand said. They're both concerned that society is increasingly run by a public school elite, distant from the everyday concerns of the plebeian hoi polloi, just to mix our classical references. So are they right to be concerned? And is there anything we can learn from the ancient world to help put things right? We've turned to TV Don, Cambridge professor Mary Beard. This is her take of the week.
As a professor of classics who does some telly, I spend most of my life reminding people that Latin and Greek, that you might think were out of date and irrelevant, are actually fun, interesting and really matter. It strikes me that someone needs to do that for politics. Even ex-prime ministers are getting fed up. This week, John Major had a point when he said the country was still run by toffs and the affluent. I mean, you only have to blink and it seems like there's yet another old Etonian in power. And as for dear old Russell Brand telling people not to vote, what a load of tosh. My mum always used to say to me, someone died to get you your vote, you damn well use it. Russell Brand was right on one thing though. We have got a bit disengaged with politics. And I think that's because politicians no longer seem to be speaking to us. They're just reading from some pre-prepared script. You try listening to some struggling junior minister on the Today programme trying to remember their lines, if you want to know what I mean. What happened to ideology? What happened to passion? Yeah. We don't want government by focus group. We don't want government by slogan. If I hear that phrase, hard-working families, one more time, I'll be rushing to the barricades and setting up a party for lazy singletons. It may be that ancient Athens does have something to teach us. One of their best ideas is what they call ostracism. Every year, the citizens got together and decided there was some politician they'd just like to be rid of for 10 years. Dead easy. They got little bits of broken pottery, they scratched the guy's name and threw it into the ballot box. Hey presto. Now, how exactly do you spell Portillo?
And from the British Academy at Carlton House Terrace to our own little Academy of National Treasures here in the heart of Westminster, Mary Beard joins us now, fresh from the Lazy Singletons launch, I hope, Mary.
Yeah.
Democracy's been going on a long time. Is it really in crisis now?
No, in some ways it isn't. I mean, in some ways every Democrat always thinks democracy's in crisis. That's what being a good Democrat is about, isn't it? Saying we could do it better. But there is a kind of commercialisation of it, which I do think, I think Russell Brand is onto something when he's saying, look, there is a kind of disconnect between us and them. And I think that the problem with them is not that they're well-meaning, quite a lot of them are finely well-meaning, they're going into this for all the right reasons, but all they're doing is talking blasted sound bites. You know, that's the hard-working families bit. I mean, I think it must be ghastly. In some ways, when I'm feeling generous, I think how ghastly it would be to be one of you guys. You've given up, don't worry.
No, I think democracy is in crisis, but for exactly the opposite reason from what Emily says. we have not had democracy for ages. We had it for about 180 years.
You've got a classicist here.
No, but I think I'm right. We had it in the 5th century BC. Then we put it away for 2,000 years. Actually, democracy now is quite a new experiment. In 1941, there were 11 democracies in the world. There are now 105. And that is why it is conceivable that it is in crisis, because most of us have very little experience of it. And what is happening now, and what democracy tends to do is it gets competing politicians to promise too much because they have to outbid each other. And the only way you can get by then is by borrowing from future generations. And that is precisely where we've got to. We personally are all far too indebted. Our governments are far too indebted. And yet the politicians go on promising more than they can afford.
But I think you're being much too gloomy, really. I mean, part of me is reasonably optimistic. No, I don't want to go back to 5th century Athens. People like me didn't have any say, being a woman, no say, no vote, no nothing. And, when I think it was, 100 years ago, I would not have had the vote. And somebody says to me, democracy hasn't been kind of coming on of late. And I think, hey, we're not doing that bad in all respects. But it's that kind of, I sit down and I think about poor old MPs in Parliament, and they're looking at their iPhones in the morning, and they're being told...
The what line to say?
Slogan of the day is hard-working family. They didn't go into politics for that, did you?
Alan, yeah, what about the junior minister, the Minister for the Today programme, who has to come up with an alarm clock or a hard-working one or stick to whatever they've been told? It's painful, isn't it?
It is painful to listen to, and I was one of those junior ministers doing it, as Michael would have been one day. But that's about the media. That's about 24/7 media, very briefly. 24/7 media that makes demands on politicians today.
So they have to do that? You're saying they have to do that?
Well, yeah, it would be very unusual. Otherwise, you get empty-chaired, or you get, the presenter says we invited a government minister, but none were prepared to come. The way you do it, I think, is quite important. I mean, you don't have to sound like a speaking clock. You don't have to sound as if you're reading a brief. I mean, if you've got any kind of... You're not usually talking about great affairs of war and peace. You're talking about a policy that you're responsible for and you would have helped shape. So it's not difficult to put a bit of interest.
And it's also perfectly respectable. What anybody who runs an enterprise in common with other people, whether it's a company or a football team or trying to do the school play, you actually have to agree on what your position is. Now, in politics, it's more complicated because you're trying to win 44% of the vote. So the coalition of interests that you have to put together is very, very broad. But then you have to say not what you think or what you believe, but actually what you've agreed with others to say. That is a perfectly respectable thing to do. But I will say that if you do it for 20 or 30 years, I think it becomes very, very wearing, always remembering to say what you've agreed with others to say.
But because most of the time it won't come off.
Keep saying hard-working families and slogans like that.
And I don't entirely buy it. I mean, I think actually most of the electorate, we know that politics is a very inexact science. We know that there aren't right answers. We know that there are disagreements. We know that it's bound to be a fudge, and we know there are mistakes.
What happens though when a politician breaks a promise, like a Nick Clegg, fees promise? Do you think, I understand the situation that led to him doing that, or do you just think he broke that promise? I'm never forgiving a Lib Dem again.
I think, look, guys, you're trading in certainties. It's no good to trade in simple certainties, whether that's about...
So better they tell us nothing?
Better that they accept... Look, what does Al Murray say? It's always more complicated. We can actually take over the idea that it's complicated. We don't have to be told that, whether it's in foreign policy that, this regime is nasty until we discover it's nice, or vice versa. We don't have to say we know what to do about student fees, debt, inflation. We know that we don't know.
What happened to Nick Clegg? What happened to Nick Clegg is a very important lesson. Nick Clegg made promises because he never for a moment thought that he was going to be in office. Now, what should the British electorate do with that piece of information? They should think, who is it that's not going to be in office next time? It's people like UKIP. Therefore, we should listen to what they say and understand that they're only saying things because they know they're not going to be in office. That is the lesson that we should learn from that.
Does that apply to Russell Brand, Alan?
Well, I tried very hard to find something in what Russell Brand said, because he's got 7.1 million Twitter followers, all of them, you know, under 30. And people were telling me, younger people, that, you know, this guy's onto something. But having read through a lot of his stuff, New Statesman piece in particular, I could find nothing other than trying to intellectualise his own apathy. And I've heard this over and over again, they're all the same, which is the kind of mantra of the reactionary over the years.
I've got one answer to Russell Brand, really, which is to say, look, you don't not vote. You go down to the polling station, you cross it all out if you don't like those on the ballot paper, and you put none of the above spoilt paper. And, you know, one day, you know, the returning officer will have to get up and say, there was 20,000 spoilt ballot papers, and I think we declare the spoilt ballot a winner.
Or they finally put none of the above on the paper.
I mean, Mary's made a very good point this evening that there's a lot of laziness in politics and people repeating slogans and so on. But it is nothing by comparison with the laziness of the critics of politics. And Russell Brand is an example of that absolute basic intellectual laziness.
So what do you do with all the people that want to follow him? I mean, you know, 7 million Twitters, that interview got some 10 million hits on YouTube. What do you do with that invigorated, enthusiastic
Get engaged
apathy?
in politics. I mean, the one thing he did have a real point about is young people today. We were just talking about student fees, getting rid of education maintenance allowance, the idea you can't draw any benefits if you're under 25. There seems to be, you know, this is very broad brush, but elderly people are protected, younger people aren't. And as someone has pointed out, older people vote, and therefore politicians perhaps do play to that audience. So the things that Russell Brand wants, which is to save the planet, he says, and a more equal society, which is what John Major was kind of touching upon, that's what I want. That's what I came into politics for. But I didn't come into politics to repress all other opinions, which is what a revolution, I'm afraid, Russell actually does, if you take it away from people's votes.
And the John Major point, just to bring us back to that, Mary, and you can possibly address that, is that politics looks the same. It's elites of school, of education, of gender as well. And that's why it's just isolating so many people.
Yeah, but I think you've got to, you've got to face up to Brand, and you've got to argue about method. You know, that he's actually no good to say, head in the sand, guys, they're, you know, a plague on all their houses, what a load of tosh politics is. You know, actually, you know, that's what you learn from the ancient world, really. You don't learn any single method. You learn that politics is about being a citizen, that's what we all are. Every single one of us is a politician, and it's our duty to think about it in a properly complicated way and to hold you guys up to account for being so blasted simplistic.
Isn't it the case
I
that
don't like simplicity.
Isn't it the case that in ancient Greece the citizens were obliged to participate in politics? They were literally roped in, were they not?
On one occasion.
Don't you have to run off to the jungle, Mary? Are we wrong about this? Did you get an invitation to the jungle this time?
I couldn't possibly comment, Emily.
We better end it on that note.
Comment.
Now it is late. Emily Maitlis late.